"Dad, who is walking in Mommy's room?" The question landed like a pebble in a still pond, spreading rings through a house that had learned to hold its breath. Daniel Hale heard it from the hallway, a small voice that carried with more certainty than the silence that had lived in the mansion since Sophie died. Eli was 8, and Eli was supposed to be asleep, but the boy's question pulled Daniel toward the closed door, toward the room that had become a monument to absence. He had not expected footsteps. He had not expected presence. He had expected the precise emptiness of organized grief, measured in framed photographs and untouched jewelry boxes. He had not expected movement. Eli had been born without sight. Doctors had said congenital cortical blindness. They had said the pathways had not formed. They had said therapies could at best teach compensation, strengthen other senses, but vision, true vision, would not come. Daniel had not accepted their calm certainties. He had hired specialists, flown Eli to clinics abroad, paid for experimental therapies, covered shelves with donor reports and invoices. The house answered with machines, with schedules, with silence punctuated by whispered appointments. The world around them offered everything that money could buy, and yet, in the center of it all, there was a child who did not see his mother every morning, who never watched her tie her scarf or adjust her hair. Sophie's room, with the wallpaper she had chosen and the orchid she had nursed, had been sealed like a reliquary, a place where Sophie existed only in the careful light of memory. Outside, the city glittered with other people's certainty. Inside, there was poverty of a different kind, a poverty of touch and presence that no staff could reconcile. Drivers came and left, lawyers checked papers, philanthropic invitations filled the calendar. But Eli's world was a small, dark planet he navigated by texture and sound. He knew the feel of his father's cuff, the weight of his favorite book, the scratch of the rug by the window. He had names for many things he could not see, and he had a private language with Sophie, who used to hum while she folded his socks. The doctors had told Daniel that Eli's condition was permanent. Daniel, precise and proud, had turned that diagnosis into a mission. When Daniel opened the door to Sophie's room, he did not expect to find anyone. And at first there was nothing but a scent, a seam of lavender and lemon that Sophie used to favor. Then he saw movement, a small figure standing at the foot of the bed, hands lifted toward the air as if to feel light itself. Eli stood there beneath the portrait of Sophie, clutching a faded shawl to his chest. He was humming, a sound Daniel had only ever heard when Eli fell asleep. On a small nightstand, an old ribbon lay, a strip of navy blue that Sophie had braided into the baby's blanket the year Eli was born. Eli had wrapped that ribbon around his fingers until the thread fit like a map between his fingers and something beyond the dark. Daniel could not believe what he saw. For 30 seconds, wrongness and rightness wrestled inside him. His first thought was that someone had contrived the scene, that a staff member or a guest had placed Eli there for a tableau he could sign checks for. But there was no theatricality in his son's posture. There was a raw, shy steadiness. The steps he had heard came not from a stranger, but from Rosa, the new housekeeper, a small woman with knuckled hands and eyes like warm stone, who had entered earlier that day to dust the widow's shelves. Rosa had spent an hour quietly tending to Sophie's room, speaking to objects as if they were living things, rearranging a chair, smoothing the shawl that Sophie had loved. When she noticed Eli, she had sat on the bed and started to teach him with her palms, with the steady economy of someone who had learned to move mountains with a broom and a needle. Rosa was the kind of person whose life had been a series of small, unremarked miracles. She had come recommended by a neighbor, Maria Alvarez, who tended the community center church, and she had more than once upset protocols with her simple methods. Daniel had not wanted to hire help he could not control. He had insisted on background checks and references, on a schedule that rendered the help a set of tasks to be executed. Rosa showed up with patched shoes and a satchel of things she called her tools. She brought no degrees, only a way of looking. The promise of change had been planted when Daniel saw Eli standing there, clutching the shawl, Rosa's voice at his ear like a low instrument. Daniel did not yet know whether what was happening would hold, whether it was a trick of imagination. He only knew that he had heard footsteps in a room that was supposed to have only memory, and that behind the footsteps there might be a doorway not only to his son's senses, but to his own buried pride. If medicine had failed, if technology had been nothing but thin light against the dark, perhaps something plain and domestic might become a conduit. Before Eli, before Sophie, before the hush of the house became its own language, there had been a life in Daniel that ran different, fast, organized, precise. There had been the years he and Sophie built their marriage on deals and late nights, on her quick laughter and his slow plans. Sophie had been the softer force, the woman who took their chaotic calendar and embroidered margins of tenderness into it. When she fell ill, there was haste, and then there was absence, and the mansion became a ledger of what could not be bought back. Daniel folded the loss into schedules and appointments so neatly he forgot to cry. Eli absorbed the absence, learned to walk with the shape of Sophie's absence like a guide. The boy learned the pattern of things, where sunlight warmed the rug, where the kettle sang its cautionary note, where the picture of Sophie smiled with patience. Eli's backstory arrived in small parcels. He had been born in a hospital where machines hummed, where Sophie had held him and whispered her name into the curve of his ear. The first doctors spoke of lack, of pathways that had not formed. And Daniel moved like a man laying siege to a problem. He purchased devices and charts, arranged second opinions with specialists named Dr. Harrison, Dr. Okoye, and Professor Len, clinicians whose photographs adorned brochures. He was meticulous. He logged every therapy, every minor improvement with the same attention he had once given mergers and contracts. Yet Eli's world remained layered in textures and sound. He could name 5 different slippers from touch, could hum the exact cadence of the delivery man's whistle. He loved the smell of Sophie's cooking the way other children loved cartoons. And he kept one of Sophie's gloves in a drawer, rubbing the leather at night like a talisman. Rosa's backstory unfurled in different strokes. She had raised 3 children in a small apartment that always smelled faintly of starch and citrus. She had worked as a seamstress and cleaner, mending not only fabrics but the social fissures around her. She knew how to coax life from cast-off things, how to hear someone through silence. Her hands had learned language, mapping grooves of memory on a closed eyelid like a cartographer. She had cleaned chapel pews and school hallways, had sat beside men dying in a room in exchange for tea. When she came to the Hale house, she smelled the house's grief and did what she had always done. She began to put things back so people could find them again. Daniel's backstory, the one that colored his hard edges, was a study in strategy. He had grown up in a town where scarcity made men sharp, where a first job in his father's warehouse taught him the value of order. He rose through a world that rewarded control. He knew how to command attention, how to make firms bend to his will. Yet Sophie and Eli had introduced variables he could not optimize. The boy's blindness was an equation that his spreadsheets could not resolve. His grief turned into a campaign, an investment. He rationalized sorrow into purpose, thinking if he could restore Eli to sight, he could restore part of Sophie, could close the ledger of what he had lost. Pride motivated him as much as love, a private furnace that hissed at the thought of failure. After the door incident, the house began to rearrange itself around possibility. Rosa did not make pronouncements. She moved small. She brought a chipped tin with aromatic herbs, adorned a strip of Sophie's ribbon, a little jar of pomade Sophie had once used for a stubborn splinter of hair. She sat with Eli in Sophie's room and taught him to find light by texture and by measuring shadows with the tip of his fingers. Her lessons were tactile and musical. She taught him to follow the hush of slippers, to identify the resonance in different floorboards, to time his steps with the echo under the staircase. Each lesson was a ritual without fanfare. Their first exchanges were awkward, halting, the kind of simple sentences that hide deep repairs. "Feel this," Rosa said, pressing the ribbon into Eli's palm. This was Mommy's. Eli smelled and smiled, his fingers pressing into the thread as if to read the map. "Is she here?" he asked. "She is where the light goes when it sits on the window," Rosa answered. Daniel watched from the doorway, arms crossed, a polite distance of authority. He had taken pains to keep household staff to routines, not revolutions. Rosa's methods were messy to him, not neat enough to be measured, not scientific enough to be endorsed in reports. He told her once in a voice like a closed door that he needed staff who followed instructions. She tilted her head and said, "I follow what the child needs." That line, small and soft, lodged in him. The medical record was a ledger of setbacks. Dr. Okoye had performed a battery of tests, an electroencephalogram to measure cortical response, a functional MRI that showed underdeveloped occipital cortex, an array of visual evoked potentials that arrived without the peaks the team had hoped for. The sequence of documentation was precise. The report read as a map of absence, words like non-reactive and congenital forming a pattern of definitive negation. Daniel had brought Eli to an overseas clinic 5 times, where Professor Lin had offered a therapy involving virtual stimuli and neural retraining. The early logs showed minor increases in latency, then a plateau. Daniel spent nights scanning clinical studies in his office, annotating margins, importing graphs he never gave. He hired a private therapist named Thomas, who used a steady protocol of sound and touch. Thomas was gentle, clinical, an Englishman with soft palms and cautious optimism. He offered rituals of repetition, measured progress in millimeters. One night, after a coda of failed tests, after another round of professionally worded pity, Eli woke and named a color. He called out "blue" in a voice that matched the sound of the word. Daniel had been present, hand resting on a file, the city's lights like a spreadsheet through the window. He moved toward Eli as if toward a signal. "Where did you hear blue?" he asked, taut, the scene suddenly strung with hope. Eli felt his father's face with his palm and said, "By Mommy's ribbon, it smells like sky." Daniel's first instinct was to measure the moment against the clinical record. It did not fit. He wanted to call Thomas to schedule an immediate battery of tests. Thomas advised caution, suggesting a controlled environment and a structured evaluation. Daniel, who had been living in the future tense, agreed and arranged a visit to a leading pediatric ophthalmologist, Dr. Harrison, who came with a team and a practiced seriousness. When the first clinical evaluation showed a flicker of response, skepticism tightened into a public debate inside the household. Dr. Harrison found a trace reaction in a visual evoked potential, a brief waveform that suggested some cortical engagement. He spoke in terms that were careful. "We are seeing a signal," he said, "but it is not conclusive. It could be an artifact, or it could represent nascent activity. We need to replicate." Daniel wanted replication immediately. He organized a sequence of tests, petitioning a neuro-ophthalmology lab to run longer monitoring with different stimuli. The lab technician, Javier, a man with an easy smile from the university, ran the equipment, and they recorded small ripples that might be real. The initial public conversation among staff swelled. Maria, the neighbor, called Rosa and asked for details. Reverend Hale from the community center said he could bring prayer if they wanted. Anna, the gardener, left blossoms at the doorstep. The house turned into a small theater of competing narratives: science, superstition, cautious hope. Rosa continued her steady, tactile instruction. She taught Eli to name textures against Sophie's chair, to scent the lemon oil on a dressing table, to differentiate the velvet of a curtain from the cotton of a pillow. She introduced an object of simple meaning, a small stone Sophie had kept in her pocket, smooth and cold, that Rosa called the sentinel. The stone became a focus, a simple anchor for Eli to fix his hands on when he tried to imagine light. Rosa would say, "Imagine the way sunlight warms the sentinel," and Eli would close his eyes and hold the stone until his breath slowed. These lessons seemed to bypass the clinic's frameworks because they were not data-friendly. They were ritual. They were domestic. Daniel's pride became a problem. He resisted the irregularity of Rosa's methods. He believed in metrics, and he could not bear the idea that a woman with no formal credentials might be producing results he couldn't buy with money. He scheduled a meeting with the house staff and told them to limit interventions to those prescribed by therapists. "We follow the plan," he said, voice tight. Rosa met his eyes and said nothing. Eli, overhearing, placed his hand on Daniel's thigh and said, "I like when Rosa tells me stories." Daniel felt something uncoil in him, a tenderness he had cordoned off. He dismissed Rosa for a week, sending a message through the staff that he wanted fewer variables, more control. The house hummed with quiet compliance. Rosa, with dignity that was not drama, left on the next bus and returned to her neighborhood where she mended church linens and watered basil. For 3 days, the house lost its small, improvisational atmosphere. Eli became quiet in a way that made the walls thicker. He wandered Sophie's room with small, tentative hands and touched objects as if hoping the surfaces would answer. The absence of Rosa's hands was a palpable lack. Daniel, watching, felt a new kind of failure, one that was less about diagnosis and more about his own capacity to recognize what mattered. He scheduled another test, then another, as if the sheer weight of data could replace presence. The technicians ran measurements, researchers like Javier sat with clipboards and asked Eli to follow lights with his eyes while a machine recorded the brain's whisper. The results were ambiguous. The waveforms chewed at Daniel's patience. He had wanted a clean bar graph that would absolve him of doubt. Instead, he found ripples and possibilities. On the 4th day after Rosa's dismissal, Eli woke and started to sing a tune Sophie used to hum. It was crooked, private, like a thread of voice catching on a memory. Daniel walked toward Sophie's room, drawn by the sound. He paused at the door and listened as the melody wound through the air, as if Sophie herself had returned to tend to the house. When he opened the door, he caught a sight that reshaped him. Eli sat on the edge of the bed, the shawl draped over his knees, and across the room a shaft of late-afternoon light slanted through the curtains. Eli did not see in the way the rest of the world understood seeing, but he raised his hand and leaned his palm toward the light. For an instant, the line of dust motes between his fingers looked like a river. Eli smiled, as if at a secret. At that moment, the conflict between Daniel's pride and the small, ragged hope became raw. He could not accept that ritual and care might be the mechanism of change. He wanted logos, not poetry. He called Thomas and then Dr. Harrison and demanded a public evaluation. The household staff buzzed. Neighbors learned of the scheduled test. Someone from a local paper reached out. Daniel arranged a small demonstration, a controlled room with calibrated lights, a screened panel with colored shapes. The test was to be public in the sense that family friends would watch, but clinical in its rigor. Daniel stood at the side like an actor awaiting applause or condemnation. The testing scene was thick with sensory detail. The room smelled faintly of lemon, like Sophie's perfume, as if the house insisted on memory as an accomplice. The lights were tuned to precise intensities and measured in lux. The child sat with Thomas and held the sentinel stone. Dr. Harrison gave a set of instructions, a calibrated protocol of stimuli, and Javier connected electrodes, the gel cool against the child's scalp, the hum of the machinery like a cautious animal. The sequence began. Thomas asked Eli to reach for shapes, to touch colored cards, to name what his hands encountered. The exchange between clinician and child unfolded like a ritual of evidence, an attempt to trap possibility in a net of measurements. Dialogues during the test were intricate, a ballet of 10 exchanges at least between clinician and child, between skeptical father and soft-spoken mentor. Thomas said, "Eli, can you tell me when you feel the blue card?" Eli reached out, fingers brushing air, and answered, "There is cold on my palm." Thomas tried a different prompt. "Look at my hand, Eli. Is it empty?" Eli smiled and said, "It is small like a shell." Dr. Harrison murmured, "We need repeatability." Daniel interjected, "This is important. We cannot be sentimental." Thomas responded, "We will be careful." Rosa, who had slipped back into the house that morning without announcement, sat near the door and spoke softly. "He remembers the ribbon." Daniel stood silent, his chest tight. The machine recorded a waveform that was more sustained than before, a peak that drew a sharp breath from Dr. Harrison. "There is cortical engagement," he said, "but we must replicate under different conditions." Outside the house, news threaded through the neighborhood. Maria brought a casserole. Anna left clippings from the garden. Reverend Hale stood by the gate and asked if he could press a palm to Eli's forehead. A local reporter, shy and careful, knocked politely and asked permission to observe the test. Daniel hesitated. He wanted the world to know only if the evidence was incontrovertible. The small community became invested not only because the boy might see, but because their collective hunger for witness is a human constant. They wanted a story that would tell them the world might still issue surprises. The following days were a mixture of tests and teachings. Rosa took to teaching Eli to trace Sophie's shoes, to listen to the particular creak of the second stair that always groaned in winter. She had him place his palm over a kettle to feel the intensity of sound as heat. She introduced smells illicit and potent, the aroma of citrus on a folded handkerchief, the iron tang of rain in soil Anna gathered from the garden. The house swelled with sensory cues that were signs, not proofs. Daniel pushed for data. Thomas scheduled a battery of visual-evoked potential tests, repeated with 3 different labs. The technical explanation was concise, a paragraph of exactness. Visual-evoked potentials measure cortical responses to patterned visual stimuli by placing electrodes on the scalp and recording waveforms that correspond to neural activity. Single trials can produce artifacts, hence repeated sessions and controls are necessary to distinguish noise from signal. This procedural clarity did not soothe Daniel so much as give him a checklist to complete. As Rosa worked, small signs multiplied. Eli began to point toward the window in the morning and detected the difference between early light and late light. He identified, by feeling, the glass cooling his knuckles when the sun withdrew. To find Sophie's perfume in the dressing room, and he started to hum a tune that matched a nursery rhyme Sophie once whistled. These were not dramatic revelations, but accretions of subtle change. They accumulated like pennies until they felt like a small wealth. Tension kept returning in waves. Daniel grew impatient and insisted on a meeting to reclaim control. He called a family council where he invited Thomas, Dr. Harrison, Javier, Rosa, Maria, Anna, Reverend Hale, and the house manager Marcus. The conversation was fractious. Daniel began, "We need to be methodical. We will proceed with the tests and then decide on any non-clinical interventions." Rosa said, "He is a child first." Thomas added, "Both clinical rigor and supportive rituals can exist." Marcus, a middle-aged man who had run the household for years, said, "Mr. Hale, we've seen a difference when Rosa is around." Reverend Hale lowered his gaze and said, "There is room for faith and for procedure." The room felt like a seamstress's table where different fabrics were being pinned together, each near to tearing. Eli's improvements unfolded slowly, 3 to 5 weeks of small changes that alternated with regressions. Once he cried for an hour and then woke and could speak a color. Once he could find Sophie's ring in a bowl of buttons and hold it as if it were a relic. Each moment of progress was a small miracle that strained the house's capacity for disbelief. Rumors began to weave beyond the walls. A neighbor, Mrs. Cartwright, told her book club about the boy who might see. The local paper published a human interest column. Daniel found himself both proud and exposed. His instinct to control bumped against the new reality that care was not entirely his to command. The moment that changed everything arrived on a rainy afternoon that smelled of wet earth and lemon. There was low light, the kind that makes colors look earnest and true. Eli had been practicing with a simple exercise Rosa called the beacon. She would place 3 objects on a table, each with distinct textures and a small colored ribbon hidden under it. The child had to choose an object and then find the ribbon's color by touch alone. Daniel watched, arms folded, the cameras off, the house quiet except for the rain. Eli reached, fingers hovering, and for the first time his hand moved with a decision that seemed not to come from habit but from perception. He picked up a small toy car, laughed, and then lifted his face. "Who is that?" he asked, and his voice found the word before he had a full understanding. The room was small and the objects modest. Daniel stepped forward, heart thudding. Eli's face, lit by a sliver of light through the curtain, tilted toward him. "It's Daddy," he said. There was a tremor like a coil unspooling. Daniel felt something break and unknot in his chest, a long, tense wire of withheld tenderness releasing into warmth. He walked toward his son and knelt. For a long moment they looked at each other in a way that had nothing to do with charts or theory. Daniel said, "Can you see me?" Eli reached out and touched Daniel's cheek with a deliberate palm and said, "You are warm and you smell like coffee." He laughed, "But I see the light on your watch." Daniel looked down at his wrist and at the watch Sophie had given him. The face had a small bezel of blue. Eli smiled. "Blue like the ribbon." The revelation rippled through the household and then, inevitably, beyond. There were skeptics who wanted replicable data. There were believers who wanted to organize a parade. Dr. Harrison ran a suite of tests and after the 4th session reported that visual cortical responses had increased in amplitude and consistency, showing signs of functional reorganization. He described the findings carefully, explaining neuroplasticity in measured terms. He said, "The brain, particularly in children, can reorganize. There is evidence of engagement that could support functional vision in certain contexts." Daniel felt his chest loosen, a pressure valve letting tide out. The climax unfolded slowly, but with undeniable emotional weight. Daniel took Eli by the hand and led him down to Sophie's room, the site of the first footsteps, the place where the ribbon had become a secret code. He sat on the bed and watched as his son extended his hand toward a portrait of Sophie and then toward Daniel. "Is she happy?" Eli asked. Daniel found himself answering for the both of them. "She used to dance in the kitchen," he said. "She would sing off tune and clap because she loved." Eli giggled. "I can see the shape of her hands," he said. He extended his palm and seemed to trace air, catching light like a net. Daniel recognized, with a clarity that hurt and healed, that the boy was seeing in a new way that belonged to a world of thresholds, not absolutes. The final confrontation with Daniel's pride came when he was asked, publicly and privately, to acknowledge Rosa. Journalists called, and the local community gathered at the gate. Marcus arranged for a small statement. Daniel stood at the threshold of Sophie's room and faced the cameras with a voice that felt fragile and honest. He said, "My son's progress would not have happened without many people who loved him." He named Rosa. He named Dr. Harrison, Thomas, Javier, Maria, Anna, Reverend Hale. He admitted things he had not admitted before, that money did not fix everything, that patience and touch had been part of the medicine. Rosa stood slightly apart, her hands folded, her eyes like small, steady lamps. When Daniel approached her, he knelt before the stooped woman in a gesture that felt like contrition and gratitude at once. "Thank you," he said, and the words sounded like an offering. The final scenes braided reconciliation, humility, and a public test that sealed the narrative arc without making it a tidy scientific victory. There was a demonstration at a pediatric center where Eli, now practiced and confident, identified colors, matched faces, and followed motion. The test was designed as a challenge for the child, with 13 structured trials and repetitions. He succeeded more often than the team had expected. Dr. Harrison called the results promising, not definitive, and recommended continued therapies that combined clinical interventions with Rosa's tactile rituals. In the months that followed, the household learned to live with a new grammar of presence. Daniel adjusted his life, not by giving up everything, but by reordering priorities. He walked with Eli in the garden, taught him to identify the shape of trees by the edges of their shadows, and started to attend small community events where his son ran with other children, eyes bright with the kind of mischief only partially tamed by lessons. Rosa continued to teach, now with a small corner of the study set aside for her simple tools, and Eli grew in competence and curiosity. The city took an interest, charitable foundations sent notes, and the story became a quiet exemplar of how private humility can change public outcomes. 1 month later, Eli had a new rhythm. He woke each morning and asked for Sophie's shawl to carry to breakfast, a small comfort he had claimed as ritual. He could trace the pattern of light on the kitchen table well enough to put his cup down without spilling. He had started a sight journal where he and Daniel wrote simple notes about colors they encountered. They called it the palette. He learned to recognize 3 primary colors reliably, and his teachers at home, Thomas and Rosa, documented the progress with photographs of tasks he completed. The family kept a modest log, a string of small, verified improvements. Socially, he began to engage with a few children, though noise and crowded places remained challenging. Daniel rearranged his schedule to spend weekday evenings reading in the living room, the 2 of them sharing stories with the lamp turned low. Daniel volunteered to speak at the community center about supporting families facing long-term disability. He did so with an honesty that surprised the audience and himself. 3 months after the first footsteps, Daniel and Eli traveled to the overseas clinic where Professor Lin, the neuroplasticity researcher, conducted a follow-up. The data showed measurable reorganization, cortical responses that were more consistent, and an improvement in functional visual tasks like object recognition in high-contrast settings. Eli had adapted strategies taught by Rosa, such as scanning with small head movements and using sound cues. The combination of clinical therapy, home-based rituals, and community engagement had produced a pattern that suggested sustainable improvement. Daniel wrote a public note of thanks that mentioned Rosa by name, and the note circulated among neighbors and staff. The public tone of gratitude softened the old man's image, turning him from a distant industrialist into a father learning. The household budget changed modestly to support ongoing care and community programs in Sophie's name. 6 months in the house had normalized a new way of living. Eli read a simple book to his father and loved to stop at pages that described the sky. He had a new teacher at the local school who used inclusive methods to help him follow visual tasks. Daniel and Rosa had developed mutual respect, their earlier fraught exchanges replaced by a quiet teamwork. The house became a place of small gatherings, evening meals that Sophie would have approved of, a place where neighbors dropped by and where Anna left sunflowers in the morning. The local paper wrote a follow-up piece that focused not on miracle language, but on community networks and the importance of humility and caregiving. Daniel donated funds to a research program focused on pediatric sensory rehabilitation, stipulating that some money be earmarked for community-based support and tactile learning. Eli kept Sophie's ribbon in his pocket. He sometimes pressed it to his lips when he had a difficult day and spoke out loud to her as if in a conversation across rooms. When asked later what changed everything, Daniel would say the obvious and the unadorned. He would say it had been a convergence of tried medicine and patient loving, of science and ritual. He would mention Dr. Harrison and Thomas and Professor Lin. He would insist on the instruments and the data. He would, with equal steady voice, mention Rosa, the woman with a satchel of ordinary things who taught a boy to find light in a house full of ghosts. He learned to name things he had been ashamed not to know, like how a child's patience can be a better scaffold than the neatest clinical protocol. In private, he would sometimes return to the day of the first footsteps, to the way the ribbon had smelled and the way Eli had reached for light. And he would thank Sophie aloud in the empty room, because gratitude had become a practice he wanted to keep. If this story leaves a final thought, it is that miracles are often the work of ordinary hands that refuse to accept limits as law. The boy who once navigated only in textures and sound now walked toward light as if toward a friend. The man who had equated love with solvability learned to equate it with presence. And the woman whose knuckled hands taught a child to feel light, who mended cloth and mended more, became the quiet engine of a transformation that no certificate could fully capture. If you have been moved by this account, if you have lived through a small act that changed everything, share it below. Begin your comment with "My gesture" and tell us in a line what small thing shifted a world for you. Your story matters, and it helps others feel less alone. If you want more narratives, remind us of what love can do, consider subscribing. The smallest hands sometimes change the largest lives.